Welcome to the 10th episode of the Sports World with Patrik. This is your host, Patrik. Of course, like I mentioned in the last episode, we are going to the Swedish Hockey League, which is also, of course, um, involved with the Swedish Hockey Ice Hockey Association. Of course, something very different about the SHL. Of course, this is the men's league that Sweden has. And just like the SHL, let's get off started with this. So, the SHL was actually founded in 1975, of course. At the time, it was known as the Swedish Elite League, and it did feature 10 teams. It has now, officially since then, has expanded to 14 teams. Of course, um, it more recently gained a second tier league called the Hockey Allsvenskan. Of course, the SHL also does participate in the IHS. The IHF has their own league annually for the European trophy. Of course, that is called the Champions League. Of course, this includes everybody except the KHL, the Continental Hockey League, which is the NHL equivalent in Europe and in Asia. Of course, the SHL is, of course, the number one team in the Champions League. They do send the most teams to the SHL, of course. With that being said, of course, they do play, of course, in just Sweden at the moment. Some teams will end up going to play teams outside of their areas. And like I mentioned in the last episode, so a lot of these teams that are in the SHL, or SHL, I'm sorry, SHL, not the SHL, they all sort of have their own teams. So they do have the women's teams with them. So let me go ahead and list the 14 teams that are here, which is Bernas IF, Forlunda HC, Fargestad BK, HV71, Leksons IF, Linkoping HC, Luella HF, Malmo Redhawks, the IK, Oskar Shaham, Rogel BK, Skelefita AIK, Tirma IK, Jaxo Lakers, and the Aura Bro HK. Of course, like with the SHL, these teams are all sort of close by, near to Stockholm. And of course, with them having their women's league, they do sort of have their own rinks that they work with, of course, sharing it with their SCHL components, or not components, I'm sorry, their SCHL teams also. Of course, just like the SCHL, their season starts in September. It's actually late September, sort of early on in the hockey season, and of course, their regular season ends in March. Their playoffs are all the way up from March to April, and generally, whoever wins in the playoffs is, of course, the champion of the Swedish champion. Of course, they do have some very nice golden helmets for that. I was looking on their website, so it's in pretty good. Of course, they do have some of the highest spectators in Europe with the league. Of course, being part of the Champions League or Champions League. Let me see. Sorry, it's the Champions Hockey League. So they do obviously get a lot. But like I mentioned, before, just like the SHL, they do have a relegation process for their lowest teams. Of course, the lowest teams, rather than it being the same way where in the SHL, the lowest team in the SHL plays the highest team in the NDHL. This is actually sort of an IHF point where they sort of go ahead and have the two lowest teams in the SHL play each other. And then, of course, whoever loses ends up in the lower league, which is called Hockey Allsvenskan, which is the second tier, of course. And then whoever wins the Allsvenskan league, of course, they get promoted to the SHL. You can get relegated from the Allsvenskan to the Hockeyettan. Of course, that is also controlled by the Swedish Ice Hockey Association. Of course, teams that are in there are all divided by their different areas. So let's go ahead and sort of cover this too, since this is part of the SHL. So the Hockeyettan is the lowest you can go. I'm sorry, that's the third lowest you can go. So I'm sorry, the Hockeyettan is the lowest you can go. It's the fifth level, the lowest of them all. And in this area, they sort of break up their teams into three different divisions. Of course, once they sort of came to this point, they're sort of at the bottom of the barrel. So they generally will go ahead and play from there, and they generally will play there and make their way to be promoted into the Hockeyettan. Of course, in the Hockeyettan, they do split their leagues between the North, the South, the West, and the East, and teams will typically play each other. The winner, of course, plays in the qualifiers for the Hockeyettan. They will go ahead and play, and whoever does qualify, they do sort of go up one move to the Hockey Allsvenskan. Of course, this is that lower league. Of course, this league does have 40 teams in it, with them being broken up into 4 different divisions, of course. So in Hockeyettan North is Butterness HF, Kalemenas HC, Huken Kvalis HC, IF Skunval Hockey, Kalix HC, Kirula IF, Pieka HF, Stromboro IF, Vanas HC, or Onoshkovic HF is in the north. And then in the south, they do have Alveskan HK, Burabash HC, Halmstad Hammers HC, IF, Troya Lungby, Clarkona HK, Criff Hockey, Kristenstad IK, Mormus GOSIS IK, Tyrann SOSS, Vimmerberry HC are all in the south. Hockeyettan West has Borlangi HF, Falu IF, Forshaga IF, HC Dahlen, Hindlovens IF, Mariestan BOISHC, MJO BHC, Skvolde IK, Surah Hamars IAF, and Toronto's AIF. That's all the teams that they have in Hockeyista West. Now, for the last one is the Hockeyista East, which has West Bay IKHK, Encompings SKHK, Stilikuna Lemon Hockey, Hunkivins HSK, Hundin IK, Nikopings SK, Segel Torps IK, Vale Unte BK, Visby Roma HK, and Wings HC Arlena. Of course, a few notes that should be made about the Hockey Esta is that before the SHL became the top division, it sort of acted as the top. Hockey Esta sort of acted as the top division for hockey in Sweden. Of course, the Hockeyista has its own way to qualify for the SHL. If you win it, you're in, and then of course the other teams will sort of get relegated down to the to what we were talking about, hockey Tuan. Of course, this of course builds a lot of angst among players to ensure that they end up being in the top division. Of course, you do get paid the more for it. So, hockey. I'm sorry, that was the division right below hockey. Askven. Of course, the Hockey Askven is the top division now. For right below the SHL, so that was the Hockey Fin. So that's Division 1. The league right below hockey, or the SHL, is the Hockey Allsvenskan, which of course is the league that you would get demoted to if you were being relegated from the SHL. Of course, they do have quite a few teams. Some of their SCHL teams being in the top division. Some of the other teams that are in here, of course, all are sort of have been demoted or have been relegated. I'm sorry, from the SHL. Of course, the winner of this of Hockey Allsvenskan can be promoted to the SHL. Of course, over time, these teams have sort of increased their attendance, and of course, a lot of them, with the TV rights that are there for them, they sort of have their good and bad, but of course, those are just the lower end leagues for that. So let's get back to the SHL, which of course is the league we're talking about today. Of course, in the SHL, of course, there is quite a few different, with them being mainly in Sweden. Of course, they do, and closer to the Finland border, they do have two separate situations that they're in. So they do have a different TV provider. So in Sweden, their TV partners are the HV4 group, and of course they do have TV rights in Finland, which is by the Seymour Entertainment Company. Of course, as I mentioned, they do sort of compete with each other around in Europe in the Champions Hockey League, of course, competing against other European teams to see who the champion of the CHL is. I think we talked about a little bit about their relegation processes and everything. Of course, there have been some notable players to come out of the SHL, and most of these typically end up playing just in Europe and move around. The most notable that I can see of is Linus Omark. Of course, he is currently, I believe, on the Edmonton. Was he on? I'm sorry, no, he's back in Sweden. He's back in the SH. Actually, he's now in the National League playing. So he did return back to Sweden after playing with the Edmonton Oilers and the Buffalo Sabres of the NHL. Returned back, went to the KHL, which is another league we'll talk about in the National League. Of course, he initially had started off to play in the SHL, one of the more notable ones that has made their way to the United States. And of course, they do award the trophy, and at the end of the Lamont Trophy to the champion. Of course, have some very nice gold helmets there, and so the SHL is a very nice league to look at. Again, like the SHL, when their season does start back up in September, I will be more along following with this league, learning a little more about them. Of course, they have their own Swedish champion, and of course, eventually they go to the Champions Hockey League, which is actually going to be in our next episode. Is what we're going to be what I'll be talking about is the Champions League, which is of course the European champion of the world. Of course, they do have a lot of items in common. Of course, you want to be the top person in the CHL. Of course, multiple different teams make it there. Sweden's been sending a lot of teams to this. Of course, in the CHL that we'll talk about later on, it's, like I mentioned, it's actually sponsored by the IHF. Sort of their big league in Europe besides the KHL. Of course, KHL teams are not included in the CHL. But of course, we'll talk more about that. So this will be all for this episode. And I will be back tomorrow with another episode about the Champions League. Thank you.